They swore before the whole household that she had married their kinsman only to plunder him, and had robbed the failing house under his own roof and played him false besides. And the young wife they branded a fortune hunter and a thief could have named the man who truly hid the deed and forged the proofs against her with a single breath, and did not. Because the one thing that would clear her hung, stitched plain in colored silks upon a wall, in a dead woman's needlework that no one in all that house had ever thought worth the reading. And she did not yet know it. Honoria Aldercott, that had been Honoria Marlowe, was 23 years old and gently reared and poor. A lady in all but fortune, and a bride by necessity, married by the arrangement of others and the plain need of a girl who had nowhere else to go to a cold, proud, much-burdened titled man in a great house at the head of a broad northern dale. And on a raw, bright morning in the autumn of that year the whole weight of that house came down upon her at once, when there were found among her own papers and boxes a heap of forged letters and false receipts that seemed to prove, plain to every willing eye, that the poor Viscountess had been secretly selling off the family's plate and treasures and diverting its dwindling moneys to a hidden purse and a lover of her own. And the household, one after another, turned its eyes upon the friendless young woman they had never wanted, whom they had called a schemer from the first, and who had no one in the world to speak for her. She had not touched a thing of that house but to cherish it. She had come, unloved, into a cold home and tried in her quiet way to be worthy of it, and would have flung herself between any harm and the ancient honor of the name she now bore. But she was poor, and alone, and a stranger of no family that anyone there need respect, married for no love into a house that despised her, and the man who had truly stolen the estate's deed and forged the proofs against her, and taken good care that the blame should fall exactly where it fell, was the smooth, plausible, indispensable cousin and man of business of the house, Mr. Lucius Aldercott, a grasping kinsman who governed all that touched the estate and had, in his secret ruin, labored for years to see the property fall to himself, and who had stolen away the true deed of settlement that stood between him and the inheritance, and now framed the young wife as a thief and a wanton to see her cast out childless and disgraced, both to clear his own road to Cheverel Court, and to be rid of the one person under that roof clever enough to be a danger to him. And so Honoria Aldercott stood accused before them all, confined a prisoner in her own rooms, her name a byword for a fortune hunter and a swindler, faced with the ruin of a public putting away and the loss of her marriage and her good name and every hope, and she could prove nothing, and no one believed her. And she did not yet know that the faded embroidered sampler that hung, dusty and unregarded, upon the wall of the very upstairs room they had shut her in, a dead lady's pretty sewing that Lucius Aldercott and all that cold house passed over as beneath a schemer's notice, held stitched into its innocent border, in a cipher a needlewoman had devised in her last year of life, the one key that would unlock the hidden place where the true deed lay and where a dead mother's own hand had left both the proof that Honoria was no thief and the proof that Lucius Aldercott was, nor that the cold, proud man who had married her without love, and who had at first believed the worst of her with the rest, would be the one to stand by her, while that truth was read out of the silk before a magistrate and the whole assembled household on the very day her ruin was to be made complete. It was the middle of October, and the dale was going brown and gold under a hard, clear sky, when the forged proofs were cried and Honoria Aldercott's world came down. And that gray autumn is where the turning of her story begins, though the crime that made it necessary had been years in the quiet making in the mind of Lucius Aldercott. I have been waiting a long time to tell you Honoria's story, the loveless marriage and the false accusation, and the smooth schemer who meant to see her cast out and ruined for his own crime, and the faded sampler on the wall that held the key to it all, and the cold hard man who first believed her guilty, and then came to see her true, and to break the frame that had been built around her. So settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a young gentlewoman who has been called a fortune hunter and a thief before the whole household she was married into, and shut up to await a public ruin, and made to feel the whole cold weight of a great family's contempt with no friend to speak for her and no proof she can lay her hand on, is about to find that a dead and gentle woman she never knew saw the danger long before it came, and left her stitched plain and colored silks upon a wall that a schemer's blind eye passed over as decoration. The means to undo the whole false design, and what she does when at last the cipher is read and the hidden place is opened and her own truth is drawn up out of the very fabric of the house. Before the very people who thought they had her ruined is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how a gently reared young woman came to stand accused of robbing the house she had been married into, in a home where she had come a friendless bride and tried to be worthy, you have to understand what had been done to her, and how it was possible, and who did it. For the cruelty of her story turns on a thing that has ruined more honest women than any open violence ever did: the ease with which the poor and friendless may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and powerful, and the readiness of a comfortable world to believe the worst of a portionless woman who has married above her station. She had not always been poor in spirit, whatever she was in purse, and that is the first thing to know of her, for it made the fall so much the harder to bear. She was the only child of the Reverend Josiah Marlowe, a gentleman of the middling sort, a man of no estate at all but of real and deep learning, and a warm and honest heart, who had lived quietly in a small Dale parish, and had spent his slender means and his whole strength upon the things he loved, which were his people, his few good books, and above all the patient antiquary study of old hands and old tongues, of charters and registers and the crabbed secret scripts and ciphers of a bygone age. He had a shrewd exact eye for a forged charter or a false hand, and a delight above all in the unriddling of a hidden meaning, the cracking of an old cipher, the reading of a message set down to be read by one and hidden from the rest. And though he was never anything but poor, he had made himself, in that one quiet field, a man whose word on a doubtful old document was sought by scholars far grander than himself. He had married for love a gentle, delicate, accomplished lady, a fine needlewoman whose sewing was the wonder of the parish, and had lost her young, when their daughter was but 9, and thereafter he had bound himself more closely than ever to the motherless girl who was all he had left of the wife he had loved. He taught her himself, far beyond the common run of a girl's schooling. She sat at his side over his old charters and his ciphers, and learned to read a crabbed old script and unriddle a hidden meaning as easily as in her earliest years her mother had taught her to set a fine and faithful stitch. And she grew into a young woman of unusual cultivation and discernment, quiet and grave and deeply taught, with a clear, steady mind and a modest, reserved manner that hid, from all but those who knew her well, the fine trained intelligence beneath. She was no fine lady to be idle and admired. She was her learned father's pupil and her lost mother's needle daughter both, and had 2 gifts of them that the world thought nothing of, and that were, though she did not yet know it, to be the saving of her life: the eye of a fine needlewoman, that could read a piece of stitching as another reads a page, and the mind of a cipher scholar, that could see a hidden meaning where the world saw only ornament. And her father, knowing that he could leave her nothing, had given her instead the only fortune he had, a mind and a skill and a name. And he had done, in his last months, one careful, anxious thing that I will come to, for though it is not the hinge of her story, it is the shape of the man, and the reason she was armed in mind for what came. For Josiah Marlowe, in his last years, was uneasy, in a way he could not quite name, about a world in which a portionless gentlewoman of no family and no protector was a creature strangely without defense, at the mercy of any powerful person's malice, with no one to take her part. He had no strong box to leave her and no proofs to hide, for he had no enemy in the world. But he did the one thing he could, and charged her, again and again in those last gentle months, holding her hands and looking at her very gravely, to trust always the evidence of her own trained eyes and her own clear mind above the loud certainties of the world, to remember that the truth is often written plain for those who have the wit to read it, in the very places the careless and the grasping pass over, and never, whatever befell her, to believe herself beaten while she had her wits and her needle and her honest name. She had thought it at the time only the tender, anxious fancy of a dying father, and she had wept, and promised, and thought no more of it, being in no extremity then, only grieving. But those words were in her still, and she would have need of them now. For her father died when she was 22, of a slow decline, and left her very poor, and Honoria Marlowe, who had never had to think of money, found herself alone in the world with a little furniture and her father's books and her mother's needle, the small savings gone, and the plain hard necessity before her of some provision for her life. She met it, as she met everything, quietly and with courage, but she had no near relations to turn to, and no fortune, and no protector, and few in that quiet country who could do more than pity her. And here it was that others took her life in hand, for there was, distantly connected with her mother's family, a well-meaning but managing kinswoman of some consequence, a Mrs. Prudence Gale, who took it upon herself to settle the portionless orphan's future in the way that seemed to such women the only sensible one, and when it came to be known that the proud young Viscount Ledbury, master of the great debt-strained seat of Cheverel Court at the head of the Northern Dale, being pressed on all sides to marry and secure his line, and being wholly indifferent whom he married so it were an unobjectionable gentlewoman who would not plague him, was in a mind to take a suitable wife with no fuss and no fortune-hunting mother behind her. It was Mrs. Gale and her like who saw the advantage, and made the match and brought the thing about. And so Honoria Marlowe, portionless and friendless, and with nowhere else on earth to go, was married, in the late summer of that year, with very little of love and very little of joy on either side, to Gabriel Aldecott, Viscount Ledbury, and became the Viscountess of a house that did not want her, and went, a cold and unwelcomed bride, to the great house of Cheverel Court at the head of the broad Northern Dale, and there, all unknowing, she walked into the place where her ruin was waiting. The family she came to be a part of was an old one, cold and proud and much reduced, clinging to its ancient consequence in a house too large and costly for its shrunken means. The head of it was Gabriel Aldecott, the young Viscount Ledbury, a grave, hard, silent man of some 38, who had come young to a burdened title and spent his manhood in the cold hard business of keeping the old name from going wholly under. His father, the late Lord, had been dead but a little while, and it is with the late Lord, and with something the late Lord's own wife had done, that the whole hidden heart of this story lies. For the affairs of Cheverel Court stood, though Honoria did not yet know it, in a doubtful and a dangerous case. The old Viscount, Gabriel's father, had in his lifetime done a wise and a loving thing, seeing the tangle of an ancient entail that might in certain events carry the estate away from his own son and into a distant and unworthy branch of the family. He had with much pains and cost cut off that old entail and made a fresh settlement of the whole property upon his son Gabriel and the heirs of his body, so that Cheverel should be Gabriel's own past all question and go, after him, to his own children. It was rightly and lawfully done, and the deed of that fresh settlement, the one great paper that proved it and made all sure, was the most precious document the family possessed. But at the old lord's death that deed could nowhere be found. It had gone strangely, silently missing, and without it, the fresh settlement could not be proved, and the estate stood, in law, upon the old superseded footing, so that if ever it should come to a question, and no deed be found, and Gabriel die without a lawful child of his own, the whole of Cheverel Court would fall, under the old conveyance, to the next male of the old line. And the next male of the old line was Mr. Lucius Aldecott. For over the affairs of that failing house and its tangled inheritance there presided one man, and that man was the true author of everything that came upon Honoria Aldecott. And it is time to know him. His name was Mr. Lucius Aldecott, and he was the young Viscount's cousin and nearest male kinsman, the trusted man of business and confidant of the family in all that touched the estate and its affairs, who had made himself over many patient years indispensable to the house in the ordering of its debts and its lands and its law. He was a smooth, plausible, comfortable-looking man of about 45, with a soft, grave voice and an air of easy, devoted care for the family's interest that had won the trust of the whole house. The old lord had leaned on him in all that touched the money and the law. The young Viscount left the tangle of the estate's affairs largely in his hands, and the household one and all thought Mr. Gunt, Lucius, the very soul of faithful diligence and disinterested kindness. And he was a ruined and a desperate man. For all his comfortable exterior, he was a speculator and a gamester on his own account, deep and helpless, and had lost, in wild ventures and at the tables, far more than his own small means could cover, until he was sunk in secret shameful debts he dared not confess. And he had long since fixed his whole desperate hope upon one thing that could save him, the great estate of Cheverel Court, that would fall to him, by the old conveyance he held and cherished, if only the lost deed of settlement never came to light and the young Viscount died without a lawful child. And Lucius Aldecott knew, better than any man alive, why that deed was lost. For it was he who had made it so. Years before, in the confusion of the old lord's last illness and death, when the ordering of all the family's papers passed through his trusted hands, Lucius Aldecott had found the deed of fresh settlement, and had seen in a flash all that it meant to him, and had coldly and secretly stolen it away and hidden it, so that the estate should seem to rest upon the old footing and fall, in the fated event, to himself. He had meant, at his leisure, to destroy it, but a cold caution had stayed his hand, and he had thought it safer to keep the thing hidden and in his own power against some turn he could not foresee. And so the true deed lay these years hidden in Lucius's own secret keeping, and the estate hung, all unknowing, upon his cold will. And now, by that autumn, his need had grown desperate. His creditors pressed him hard, and worse, the young Viscount had married. A wife was come to Cheverel, and a wife might bear an heir, and an heir of Gabriel's body would end forever. Deed or no deed, every hope Lucius Aldecott had of the estate. He saw, with a cold terror behind his comfortable face, that unless he could see that marriage broken and that wife cast out childless and past return before ever a child could come, his only escape from ruin was about to close forever. And he resolved upon the boldest and wickedest stroke of his whole wicked career. He would destroy the marriage. He would see the young wife cast out of Cheverel in such utter disgrace that she should be put away past all mending and never bear an heir to bar him. And he would do it so that no shadow of it should ever touch the faithful, devoted Mr. Lucius. And he had seen at once how it must be done, for the ground was ready laid. The whole Cold House already despised the poor portionless bride as a fortune hunter. The proud husband did not love her. A very little pushing would turn that ready contempt into a firm resolve to be rid of her. He would not merely have her thought a fortune hunter, he would have her proved a thief and a wanton, a swindler robbing her husband's house and playing him false, so that even the cold justice of the proud Viscount could not keep such a wife, and she must be put away in ruin, and the road to Cheverel lie open. And there was more to it than the estate, for Lucius had marked, with a schemer's uneasy eye, that this particular poor bride was the most dangerous to him, being no dull ordinary woman but a strangely clever, quiet, observant creature with a scholar's eye. The very last sort of person he wished at his elbow while he juggled the estate's affairs and kept his own dark secret. To frame Honoria would not only rid him of the danger of an heir, it would rid him of a clever pair of eyes he had no wish to have about him, and lay his whole road clear at a stroke. It was, he told himself, a masterpiece, and he set about it with the cold thoroughness of a man securing his whole future. He was in no hurry, and he made no slip. Through the early autumn he laid his ground with a patient wickedness. He let fall, here and there, and gravely and confidentially to the young lord himself, small quiet poisonous words against the young Viscountess, that it grieved him to say it, but that the poor young woman, for all her still ways, was perhaps not quite what she seemed. That a person so poor, married so high, would very naturally be tempted, and bore watching, that there had been, he feared, some small unaccountable losses about the house of late, some plate and small treasures that could not be found. And he trembled to think where the fault might lie, that his lordship would do well, in mere prudence, to have a care what his wife was about with the family's dwindling property and the family's failing purse. He did it so softly, with so grave and reluctant an air of a faithful kinsman forced against his will to a painful duty, that it seemed the very opposite of malice, but he knew the proud, reserved temper of his cousin, and the cold indifference in which the loveless marriage had been made, and knew that he was sowing, in that guarded and unloving mind, a slow seed of distrust and disgust that might spring up, when the moment came, into instant conviction. And he prepared his physical proofs with the same cold art. He had made ready, by his skill and his secret confederates, a whole show of forged evidence against her, letters and receipts in a hand made cunningly to seem like hers, that should show her selling off the family's plate to dealers for her own gain, and diverting its moneys to a hidden account, and, worst of all, a false and tender letter or two as from a secret lover, to fasten upon her the added ruin of a wanton wife. He took spoiled sheets of her own writing from her desk to study and to mimic. He procured, or had made, the seeming proofs of the sales and the losses, and he held these by him, hidden against the day he should spring his mine, to plant where a search must find them, among the papers and boxes of the wife whose ruin he had planned, so that her guilt should look, plain and damning, like the guilty work of a fortune hunter caught at last in her thieving and her falseness. And he chose his moment, and he made it. When his ground was fully laid, and the young lord's mind was sick with a distrust he could not name, Lucius Aldecott sprung his mine. He came, one grey morning, grave and heavy and full of a show of the deepest reluctance and grief, to the young Viscount, and said that he could no longer, in honor and in love of the family, keep silence, that his worst fears were, he greatly dreaded, but too well founded, that there was reason, real and dreadful reason, to believe that her ladyship had been, and was, robbing the house and playing his lordship false, and that, terrible as it was, the thing must be looked into, for the honor of the name before it went further. And the young lord, cold with a loathing long prepared and a pride cut to the very quick, and half believing already the worst of the wife he had never loved, gave the cold leave, and the search was made, gravely and thoroughly, by Lucius's own directing, and among the young Viscountess's own papers and boxes they found the things Lucius had planted there, the forged letters and receipts that seemed to show her selling the family's plate and diverting its moneys, and the false lover's letters that seemed to show her a wanton, all in a hand made to seem like her own. And that was the end of Honoria Aldecott, so far as belief or mercy went in that house, for there were the proofs, plain to every willing eye, and what more could any reasonable person want who had wanted from the first to believe the worst of her? The find was taken for certain proof, and the young lord, cold with anger and a bitter sense of a duty betrayed, accused her to her face, before the assembled household, of being the very thing they had all along called her, a base fortune-hunting adventuress who had married him for his lands and robbed him under his own roof and shamed his name besides. And Honoria Aldecott, struck to the heart, white and trembling but steady, denied it, truthfully and with all the plain force of an honest soul. She had married where she was bid and had tried to be a true wife to a cold house, she said. She had touched nothing of theirs but to cherish it. She had robbed no one and wronged no one and knew nothing of the wicked letters they showed her nor how they came among her things, but she set it into a wall of cold disbelief, for the household had made up its mind long before. And her very poverty and friendlessness and quiet cleverness, that should have moved them to doubt, were taken instead as the proof of her guilt. And so the whole cold house closed against her, united and satisfied and pitiless, in the settled conviction that the fortune-hunting nobody had robbed them and shamed them and been justly found out at last. And here, before I tell you how far the ruin ran and how low the world would have brought her, I must ask one thing of you, because everything in Honoria's story is about to begin, quietly to turn, and I would not want you to miss the turning. If you've made it this far into Honoria's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. There, that is the only time I will ask. Now stay close by her side, for she is about to be more alone than she has ever been in her life, and to learn how little the truth is worth to a comfortable world that has already decided against the poor. And she was very much alone in it, which was the bitterest part of the whole bitter business, for there was no one in that cold house or in all the country round to whom she could turn. The tale ran out into the neighborhood before the day was well begun, carried by the servants and colored by Lucius's grave regretful tongue, and it lost nothing in the telling. The beggarly nobody the good young lord had charitably married had repaid his generosity by robbing his house and diverting his moneys and shaming his name with a lover, and had been caught at last with the letters and the receipts in her own hand. And the comfortable world that heard it believed it, easily and at once, as it always believes the worst of those who have nothing. For a poor woman who has married high and then robbed her husband is the most natural thing in the world to a comfortable mind, and no one need trouble to look twice. The great ladies of the county, who had thought the little parson's portionless daughter a very good sort of person while she kept her place and was quiet, discovered now that they had always felt there was something not quite to be trusted about her. "I said from the very first that no good would come of it," said Mrs. Prudence Gale, the very managing kinswoman who had made the match, now most anxious to be thought to have foreseen its ruin. A girl raised so poor and married so high, depend upon it, the temptation was more than such a one could bear. And handsome cold Lady Sybil Caraway, who had a way of pitying people cruelly, said it was very shocking, but that one really could not wonder, that these portionless girls who caught themselves great husbands were always the worst, and that his poor dear lordship was well rid of her. Not one of them thought to ask whether the thing were even true, or whether a friendless creature found guilty in an hour on a heap of letters were not the very person a real thief would choose to hide behind. They had their culprit and their comfortable thrill of horror, and they turned their backs, all of them, and left Honoria Aldercott to her ruin, so that she learned in that one day how solitary a wronged creature may be who is poor, and has married where she was not wanted, and has no one at all to believe her. And Honoria Aldercott stood in the midst of them, ruined. She saw the whole shape of the thing that had fallen on her, though she did not yet know the hand that had built it. She saw the forged letters held up before her, and the cold certainty in every face, and the impossibility of making one soul there believe the truth. And she understood, with a sick sinking of the heart, that she was lost, that her word was worth nothing against that damning find, that she had not a friend in the house nor a proof in the world, and that she stood, a gently reared and honest woman, branded a fortune hunter and a thief and a wanton before them all, with disgrace certain and a public putting away and the ruin of her whole life before her. For it was no light thing, in that age, for a wife to be so accused. A woman put away for such causes was ruined past all mending, cast out nameless and shamed, with no place in the world and no way back, and the manufactured proofs of her thieving carried, moreover, the shadow of the law and the debtor's dock behind them. For the sums she was made to seem to have robbed were great. She was not merely turned from a door, she was to be broken, wholly and publicly. A disgraced and repudiated wife, and her whole life ended at 23. She was confined to her own upstairs rooms, shut up under lock and watch in a cold disused wing of the great house, to be kept close while her husband and his grave kinsman settled the manner of her ruin and the lawyers were sent for. And she had, though she scarcely marked it in that first black hour, one plain unregarded thing before her eyes in that cold room that no one had thought to move or to notice, that had hung there dusty and forgotten for years, and that held, though she could not dream it, the whole of her deliverance. For the room they had shut her in, a disused upstairs sitting room in the old wing, had been, years before, the private sitting room of the late Viscountess, Gabriel's mother, the good and gentle Lady Aurelia, and it had been left, at her death, much as she had kept it, and little used since, so that her few personal things still stood about it, dusty and unregarded, among them the small worn work of her own hands, and chief among these, hanging framed upon the wall over the old work table where she had sat and sewn, was Lady Aurelia's embroidered sampler, a faded piece of fine needlework upon linen, the alphabet worked in bands, a pious verse below it, a little stitched house with trees and birds, and about the whole a broad, elaborate, seemingly ornamental border of colored motifs and knots and work device. The last great piece of sewing the gentle lady had done in the last year of her life. It hung there, dusty and dim, a dead woman's pretty sewing that meant nothing to anyone, when the servants had shut Honoria into the room, they had never so much as glanced at it, for what was a dead lady's faded sampler worth to people about the grim business of a great family's disgrace? It was beneath their notice, and beneath Lucius Aldercott's, who had turned that room over more than once in his years of quiet searching and reckoned everything by its worth to him and its danger, and had seen in the faded needlework only a scrap of decoration of no account, and that contempt, though none of them knew it, was exactly why it was safe. But as Honoria sat in her locked cold room, in the first dreadful stillness after the storm, her eyes wandering in her misery about the strange dead room they had made her prison, came again and again to rest upon the faded sampler on the wall, and her father's words came back to her, with a strange new and piercing weight. The thing he had told her, over and over, in his last gentle months, and that she had put by as a dying man's tender counsel and thought little of since. "Trust the evidence of your own trained eyes," he had said, "above the loud certainties of the world. The truth is often written plain for those who have the wit to read it. In the very places the careless and the grasping pass over, never believe yourself beaten while you have your wits and your needle." And her eyes came back, and back, to the dead lady's needlework, and something in the fine still needle-reading part of her that her mother had waked and her father had trained, stirred as she looked, and would not be quiet. For there was something not quite right to her practiced eye about that broad ornamental border. Something too regular and too particular in its seeming carelessness. Something set and meant and deliberate under the show of mere decoration, that no idle sampler border had, and she thought with a slow strange prickling of the mind that is no ordinary border. There is a pattern under the pattern. There is something written there. And here I must tell you the thing that neither Honoria nor Lucius Aldercott nor all that cold house knew. The careful secret thing that a dead and gentle woman had done in her last months and told almost no one, for it is the hinge of the whole story and the answer to the perfect frame. Lady Aurelia Aldercott, Gabriel's mother, had been in her quiet way a clever and a far-seeing woman, and a fine and famous needlewoman, and something more, for in her girlhood she had learned, of an old antiquary friend of her family, the curious old art of the stitch cipher, the setting down of a secret message in the very count and kind and color of the stitches of a piece of needlework, so that what looked to the world like mere ornament was, to one who held the key plain writing. It had been a girl's diversion once, a pretty accomplishment. She had not thought, in her happy years, that it should ever be more. But in the last year of her life, being then a widow watching over her grave silent son and the tangled affairs of the house, she had come, slowly and with a growing dread, to see her husband's cousin Lucius for what he was, to mark his smoothness and his secret hunger, to guess at his debts, to see how his eyes went to the estate and to the great settlement deed that alone stood between him and it, and she had come to fear, with a mother's fear, that the deed itself stood in deadly danger from him, and that if ever it were lost her son might be robbed of his whole inheritance, and any wife and children he might one day have turned out to beggary, by the smooth grasping cousin who waited. She could not prove it. She was old and failing and had no one who would believe her against the trusted Mr. Lucius, and she dared not speak, lest she only warn the schemer and hasten what she feared. And so she did in secret and with her own failing hands, a quiet and a wonderful thing. She took the true deed of settlement, whether from its careless keeping or from where she feared Lucius might reach it, and she hid it, with her own hands in a place of her own devising, deep within the old fabric of Cheverel Court, a secret cavity in the very heart of the house that only she knew, and then, that the hiding of it might not die with her and be lost forever, she worked into the innocent border of a great sampler, in the stitched cipher of her girlhood that no living soul about her could read, the exact and secret direction to that hiding place, where the deed lay, and how to come at it, set down plain in colored silk for any eye that had the wit to see the border was a message, and the key to read it. And she did more, for into the same worked secret she stitched the naming of Lucius Aldercott as the debt-ruined enemy of the house who coveted the estate, and was not to be trusted, and a few plain words of testimony and warning, that whoever should come after and read this should know the truth against whatever slanders that smooth man might spread, and should find with the deed the further proof to unmask him. She had hung the finished sampler upon the wall of her own sitting room, a dead lady's pretty sewing that no one would ever trouble to read, and she had died, not long after, trusting that someday someone with the two gifts the reading of it needed, the needle eye to see the border was no border, and the scholar mind to read the cipher, and the love to try would come and look, and find her message, and be armed. And for years no such person came. The sampler hung dusty and unregarded, and Lucius plotted, and the estate hung upon his cold will. Until there came at last into that house a bride who had of her lost mother the finest needle eye in the county, and of her scholar father the cipher learning of an antiquary, and who, shut up in disgrace and desperate in that dead lady's very room, lifted her eyes to the faded sampler on the wall, and saw that the border was a message, and thought, there is something written there. And I have, God help me, no other hope in the world. But before she could read it, and before I can tell you what came of it, I must bring into the tale the man who was to be, though neither of them could then have dreamed it, the breaker of the frame and the answer to her ruin. For on that very day of her disgrace, all unknowing, the cold master of the house was drawn, by the ugliness of the thing done under his own roof, out of the settled anger in which he had first let her be condemned. And to understand why he, of all that hard household, was the one who would not in the end let the wrong stand, and why he came to see the truth when everyone about him was so sure of the lie, you must understand who he was, for the world had him quite wrong, as it usually has such men. Gabriel Aldecott, the Viscount Ledbury, a man of some 38, was reckoned, by the county that knew him a little and liked him less, a cold, hard, proud, and disagreeable man, grave and silent and unsmiling, with a level dark eye that gave nothing away and a short way with fools, a man who kept himself apart and asked no one's love and seemed to care for nothing in the world but the cold hard struggle to keep his ruined house from falling. Cold as the stone of his own hall, said the neighbors, a hard proud man with no heart in him, who had married a poor nobody without so much as pretending to love her. And all of it, as such verdicts commonly are, was the truth turned inside out. For the Viscount was not heartless, he was only proud, and reserved, and worn hard by long trouble, and honest past the point comfortable society finds comfortable. He had come to his title young, to an estate already half ruined by his forebears' extravagance, and had spent the whole of his manhood in a grim, lonely, unthanked struggle to save it, denying himself everything, laboring like his own steward, and he had but a little while since buried the father he had honored, and taken upon himself the whole burden of the sinking house. He had married, not for love, and knew it and was not proud of it. He had married because he was pressed on all sides to secure his line before the old name died, and had taken, wearily and by others arranging, an unobjectionable portionless gentlewoman, who would bring no grasping family and make no fuss, and had shut his heart against her and given her, in the cold months of their marriage, little but a distant courtesy. It had made him hard, and silent, and old before his time, and dried the show of feeling out of him, but it had not killed the deep honest heart beneath, nor the stern sense of justice that was the bedrock of him, nor the reverence he bore his dead parents' memory, nor a capacity for a deeper feeling that he had shown to no one and all but forgotten in himself. He could not abide a lie, nor a cruelty, nor an injustice, and though he was cold with anger and a sense of betrayal at the proofs against his wife, and had in the first shock of it half believed her guilty with the rest, for the evidence seemed plain and his kinsman was sure and his pride was stung, there was in him, beneath the cold surface, something that would not quite lie easy, some stern honest instinct that was troubled, from the first, by the thing that was being done. For Gabriel Aldecott, cold and stung as he was a just man and a noticing one, and even in the anger of that dreadful day, something in the business had jarred upon him and would not be still. He had looked, once, hard and searching, at his accused wife's white steady face as she denied the charge, and he had seen there not the brazen falsehood of a guilty creature caught out, but a plain white shock, and a steady truthful denial and a proud grief, that did not fit to his stern reading, the base scheming they laid on her. He had marked, too, with a faint cold unease, how very pat the evidence was, how neatly and completely the letters had been found, and how zealously his grave kinsman's slow words had prepared them all, and he remembered, with a slow cold stirring, that it was Lucius, and Lucius alone, who had first raised the fears, and shaped the suspicion, and pressed the search, and known just where the proofs of it should fall. He put these things by, in the first press of his anger, but they lay in his stern honest mind like small stones in a shoe, and would not let him be. As that dreadful day wore on, and the first blind heat of his anger cooled into a searching displeasure, the trouble in him grew rather than lessened. For his stern soul could not endure that an innocent creature might be ruined and cast out to a nameless misery while some other and truer villainy went hidden and unpunished. He resolved, coldly and privately, that before his wife was given over to the lawyers and the public ruin he would look into the matter with his own eyes. For a just man, he thought grimly, owes that much even to a wife he does not love, if there is any chance she is wronged. And in this he was confirmed, that very day, by the one honest inside voice that reached him, for there was in the house an old servant, Mrs. Tabitha Hale, who had been the late Lady Aurelia's own waiting woman and was now the grave old housekeeper. A shrewd and faithful soul who had loved her dead mistress and had watched, with a servant's silent shrewdness, the coming and the using of the poor young bride, and she came to the Viscount, greatly daring, and said to him plainly, as an old servant may to the child she has known from a boy, that she had watched her ladyship close these months, and that whatever the letter said, the young mistress was no thief and no light woman, but as good and honest a lady as ever came into that house, and gentle to the servants and reverent to the memory of his mother whose room she had cared for, and that she for one would want far better proof than a heap of letters that any clever hand might have written before she believed such a lady a swindler and a wanton. And that there were those in that house, she added grimly and with a hard look that the Viscount did not miss, who had far more to gain by the young mistress's ruin than ever the young mistress could have gained by any thieving. The Viscount said little, but the plain honest sense of it, from a faithful old soul who had loved his mother and had no interest to serve but the truth, struck home, and hardened his stern unease into a settled resolve. And there was one thing more that moved him, though he scarcely owned it, and it was the memory of the woman's face. He was a lonely man, starved in the deep hungers of the heart, though he had long forgotten it, and had walled himself so close that he had given his own wife nothing, and looked to receive nothing. And something in the still white proud endurance of the accused woman, the way she had stood alone in the midst of them all and denied the charge, and grieved and asked no pity and did not break, had reached some deep buried place in him that had not been touched in years, and had shown him, in a strange piercing flash, that the cold stranger he had married and neglected was a creature of a courage and a dignity he had never troubled to see. He put it from him. He told himself it was nothing to the purpose, a mere idle fancy at a time of trouble. But the face went with him, the grave hazel steady eyes that had met the whole cold house without flinching, and it sharpened his unease into something almost like a personal need to know the truth of her. And so, moved by his honest instinct and his stern justice and, though he knew it not, by the first faint stirring of a heart long asleep, the cold Viscount of Ledbury did the thing no one else in that house would have troubled to do, and that broke in the end the whole cold frame. Before she was given over to the lawyers and the ruin, he sought his accused wife herself, and looked at her, and listened, and gave her, alone of all the world, the chance to be heard. He came to her in the cold upper room where she had been shut up to wait, and he came alone, and closed the door, and stood a moment looking at her with his hard unreadable eyes before he spoke. And Honoria, worn past fear by the day's dreadful blows, rose and faced him steadily, expecting nothing but a fresh reproach. The husband come to curse the wife who had robbed and shamed him, and she was startled past her guard, when instead he said, in his level quiet voice, that he had come to hear what she had to say for herself, plainly with no one by, that the evidence against her was heavy, and he would not deceive her that it was not, but that he was not wholly satisfied, and would hear the truth from her own lips. And he bade her gravely tell him whether she had done these things, and if she had not, what she knew and thought. And something in the plain stern fairness of it, in the unlooked-for justice of the cold hard man who alone would hear her, broke through Honoria's proud reserve and her despair, and she told him the truth. Steadily and simply, and with the plain ring of an honest soul, that she had married where she was bid, without love but not without an honest will to be a true wife to him and his house, that she had robbed no one and played him false with no living man, that she knew nothing of how the wicked letters came among her things, and that she was as innocent as the day, and could prove nothing, but that it was the truth before God, and she would say it though it cost her everything. And she said, too, one thing more she had scarcely dared to think, but that his fairness drew from her, that the whole show of proof had been too neat and too complete to be honest, the work of a hand that meant her ruin, and that there was but one person in that house who had first raised the alarm against her, and shaped it and pressed the search, and who alone had a plain and mighty reason to wish her gone from Cheverel and childless, and that was Mr. Lucius his cousin, who stood next to the estate if his lordship should die without an heir, and who had never shown her anything but a smooth, grave civility while he undid her in the dark. And the Viscount heard her out, in a hard attentive silence, weighing her words with his stern clear judgment, and when she had done he was silent a long while, and then said, slowly, that he believed her. He had come, he said, half persuaded of her guilt, with the proofs against her and his heart cold, but he had watched liars before, and honest folk, and knew the difference, and he did not believe that the woman before him was a thief and a wanton, and if she were indeed innocent, then a horrible wrong was being done under his own roof, and the true villain went free and prospered by it, and he would not suffer it to stand if there were any way on earth to come at the truth. And he owned to her, gravely, that his own mind had already gone, of itself, the way hers had, toward the smooth grave cousin who had so zealously undone her. And there, in that first strange grave hour of belief between them, the thing began that was to be the heart of the whole story, for the cold husband and the wronged wife, who had come together without love and lived as strangers under one cold roof, looked at each other now, across the ruin, as two honest souls facing a common enemy and a common wrong, and something passed between them, unspoken, that neither had looked to find in the other. But belief was not proof, and the Viscount, cold and clear even in his new-kindled anger, knew that his bare believing could not save her against that damning find, and that he must have some hard thing to lay against the frame, or she was lost still. And he asked her then the question that was to unlock everything, whether she knew of anything, any paper, any secret, any provision, that might serve them against so complete a lie, and Honoria, her mind flying, of itself, to the strange thing that had been working in it all that dreadful day, told him, slowly and half fearing he would think her mad, of the faded sampler on the wall of that very room, his dead mother's needlework, and of the strange conviction that had grown in her as she looked at it, that the broad ornamental border was no ordinary border, but a set and meaningful thing, a pattern under the pattern, and that she, who had of her mother a needlewoman's eye, and of her father the learning of an antiquary and a reader of ciphers, believed, though she could scarce credit it herself, that there was a hidden message worked into his mother's sampler, and that she thought she could read it. And Gabriel Aldercott, who missed nothing, went very still, and turned his eyes to the faded sampler on the wall that he had passed 1,000 times and never once looked at, his own mother's last work, and something in him, some deep-buried memory of the gentle far-seeing woman who had made it, stirred and answered, and told him that this was no madness of a desperate wife but a thread, a real thread, the first he had seen in all that dark business. He said, in a low, careful voice, that his mother had been a clever and a secret woman and a wonderful needlewoman, and had loved him and feared, he now half remembered. something in her last days that she would never plainly speak, and that if there were indeed a message in her work, then his wife, of all the world, was the one sent to read it, and he bade her try, then and there before him, that they might see what a dead woman had left upon that wall. And so the fated sampler was lifted down from its hook, and laid in the clear cold light of the tall window, and Honoria Aldercott, with her heart beating hard and her father's old training waking clear and sure in her, bent over the dead lady's needlework and began, stitch by patient stitch, to read. It was slow, and it was hard, and it took the whole of her skill and her learning and more than one long day and night of patient labor with the Viscount grave and watchful at her side. For the cipher was cunningly devised, worked in the count and the kind and the color of the stitches of that broad border, so that only one who could read a piece of needlework as a page and knew besides the old antiquary's arts of the hidden alphabet could ever have unriddled it. But Honoria had both gifts, the only creature in all that house or county who had, and stitch by stitch, band by band of the worked border, the dead lady's secret gave itself up to her. First she found the key of it, the plan on which the whole was set, and then, slowly, the message began to come clear, worked plain in silk by a hand 10 years dead. A greeting and a warning, that whoso read this was surely a friend of the house and should trust what followed and be brave, and then the naming, cold and clear, of Lucius Aldercott, the cousin, as the debt-ruined and grasping enemy of the house, who coveted Cheverel and was not to be trusted and against whom whoever came after must be armed, and then, most wonderful of all, the direction, exact and particular, to the hiding place of the true deed of settlement, that the dead lady had hidden with her own hands against his reaching. How? In a certain old chamber of the house, behind a certain carved panel by the chimney breast that a pressed spring would loose, there was a hidden cavity in the thickness of the ancient wall, and in it, wrapped and safe, the true deed of the fresh settlement that made all sure, and, laid with it, the further proof of the truth. And Honoria, reading out the last of it in a voice gone low and trembling, lifted to the Viscount a face gone white and blazing with a wild new hope, and Gabriel Aldercott, who had followed every stitched word with a growing wonder and a cold kindling purpose, understood at last, past all doubt, that his dead mother had reached out of her grave to save the house and to arm the wronged wife her son had neglected, and that here, hidden all these years in plain sight upon a wall, was the thread that led to the whole undoing of Lucius Aldercott. For here, at last was the thing that might break the frame. Here was the thread that no one else had troubled to seek, because no one else could read it. Gabriel Aldercott saw the whole shape of it in an instant. He did not yet hold the deed in his hand, but he knew now where it lay, and by whose telling and what else lay with it, and he resolved what must be done. The hiding place must be opened, and the deed and the proof brought out, quietly and lawfully and before honest witnesses, so that the whole truth should come out at once and complete and past all Lucius's power to muddy or deny. And it must be done in a way that should clear his wife before the very household that had condemned her, and save the estate, and take the skemmer red-handed at the height of his fancied safety. And he did a thing then that showed the whole stern quality of him. He did not cast her out. He went, that very hour, to his astonished household and to his grave kinsmen, and told them, in his quiet, unanswerable way, that the young Viscountess should not be given over to the lawyers nor put away, nor any further step taken against her, until he had satisfied himself to the bottom of the truth of the matter, that he was not content, and would be very sure before he ruined any creature under his name, that he was master in that house, and would answer for it. And Lucius Aldercott, when he heard of it, felt the first cold breath of a fear he had thought impossible, and set his smooth wits at once to work to undo this dangerous clemency. But the Viscount was immovable, and he kept his accused wife in the house, in a grave and now no longer unfriendly custody, safe for the while from the worst. And he set about, with his cold thoroughness, the springing of his own countermine. And here, while the deed still lay hidden and the trap was being laid, I must tell you what those strange days did, quietly, beneath the great business of the plot, to Honoria and to the cold husband who had become, all at once, her one defender. For the breaking of the frame is the turn of the story, but the heart of it is the two of them, and I would not have you miss it. They were thrown much together now, in the strange grave intimacy of her danger and her defense, and in the wonder of the thing his mother had left, for the Viscount, having taken her cause in hand, came to her often in those days, to plan, and to sit while she made sure of her reading of the cipher, because he found, to his own cold astonishment, that he wished to. And in that close hard fellowship of trouble and hope and shared purpose, for they had, each of them, a deep stake in that hidden deed, her good name and his whole inheritance both, the grave silent Viscount and the proud reticent wife who had been strangers at their own cold wedding and had lived as strangers since, came, without ever once saying so, to know each other for the first time, and to be each to the other the one true thing in a false and cruel world. He found in her a mind and spirit he had never troubled to look for in the wife he had married for duty, a cultivation to match his own buried love of better things, a clear, brave sense, a fine discernment that had read a dead woman's cipher where no other soul could, and a gentleness the cruelty done her had not soured. And she, who had thought never to find anything in the cold husband but the pride the world saw, found now, in the hard master who had at last believed her, a stern deep honesty and a lonely starved heart like her own. They spoke in those grave days of his mother, whom Honoria had never known and now felt she knew, and Gabriel spoke, haltingly, more of himself than he had spoken to any soul in years, of the long lonely fight to save the house, and even, once, gravely of the cold loveless marriage he had made and now, he owned, repented the coldness of, and she saw the hard face gentle when it turned to her. He was too proud, and too honorable, and too sore conscious of how ill he had used her, to speak a word of love to a wife he had married without it and neglected and half condemned. While her rescue lay in his hand and her wrong at his own door, he would have died before he asked, in that hour, for a love he had done nothing to earn. But she felt it, in his grave care and the fierce quiet anger on her behalf that broke sometimes through his coldness, and she knew, in her own heart, with a wonder that steadied her through those dreadful days, that she was coming, strangely and against all the cold beginning of it, to love the husband who had married her without love, and then, alone of all the world, believed her and set his whole strength between her and ruin, and the knowledge, unspoken between them, was a warmth at the center of the cold, and held them both. And when Gabriel had laid his plans, and the day was chosen and the honest witnesses secretly bespoke, they came at last to the opening of the hiding place, and it was done quietly, before it should be done publicly, that Gabriel might be sure of what lay there before he staked all upon it. In the gray of an early morning, in the old chamber the sampler had named, the Viscount and his wife and the faithful old Mrs. Hale went together to the carved panel by the chimney breast, and Honoria, reading the dead lady's direction once more from the sampler in her hands, found the hidden spring and pressed it. And with a low grating the old panel gave, and swung, and there behind it, in a dry cavity in the thickness of the ancient wall where no searcher had ever dreamed to look, lay a wrapped and dusty packet, laid there by a dead woman's hands 10 years before, and Gabriel drew it out, and unwrapped it with hands not quite steady in the cold morning light. And there, whole and safe and unhurt, was the true deed of the fresh settlement, the great lost paper that made Cheverel his own past all question, and gave the flourished old conveyance the lie, and folded with it, in the dead lady's own fine hand, a long letter, sealed and addressed to whoever should find it, her testimony out of the grave. And that letter, when they read it, was the second thunderbolt. And it was the clearing of Honoria's name, for in it the gentle far-seeing lady set down the whole truth as she had feared and foreseen it, that she had hidden the deed against the reaching of her husband's cousin Lucius, whom she named plainly a debt-ruined and grasping man with his heart set on the estate and no scruple in his way to it, that she charged whoever found this to know that any evil word or forged proof that smooth man might spread against the innocent. And here, though she could not know the name, she foresaw the very crime was a lie of his making, and that with this letter and the deed there should be found the proof of his old villainy that should unmask him. And there was a third thing in the packet, and it was that proof, and it was the ruin of Lucius past all mending. For the dead lady, in her last watchful months, had come by, and laid up there, a letter in Lucius's own hand, one he had written, years before, to a moneylender, that betrayed the whole of his desperate debts and his cold reckoning upon the estate, and his very design of coming at it, and proved him, in his own words and his own hand, exactly the ruined and grasping schemer his cousin's widow had named him. And Gabriel Aldercott, reading it all in the cold morning with his white blazing wife beside him, and the faithful old servant weeping quietly by, reached the whole truth in a cold blaze of certainty, that the very man who had raised the alarm against his wife, and shaped the slander, and pressed the search, and known where the forged proofs would be found, was himself a proven and a ruined schemer of years' standing, who had stolen the deed to steal the estate, and framed the innocent wife as a thief and a wanton to see her cast out childless and clear his road to Cheverel. He had the deed that saved all. He had the dead mother's word that cleared his wife. He had in Lucius's own hand the proof of his guilt and his motive. And he had no doubt that once the hunt was turned upon Lucius, the rest would follow. The stolen deed's long concealment, the debts, the forger's tools, the whole cold history of the man's treachery. Gabriel Aldercott looked at the things spread in the cold morning light. The deed that gave him back his whole inheritance, and the letter that cleared the wife he had wronged, and the proof that damned the kinsman he had trusted. And then he looked at Honoria's white blazing face, and for the first time in all their strange acquaintance something like a grim and terrible resolve settled in his hard eyes. He had his weapons now. He had them whole. And he had only to choose the time and the manner to strike, so that they should do the most complete and the most public and the most final work, and clear his wronged wife and unmask the schemer before the very household that had condemned her and saved the ancient house from the man who had preyed upon it. And he chose, with a cold sense of justice almost terrible, to make the exposure absolute and public and past all undoing. He would call the household together, and bring the law, in the person of the county magistrate and the family's honest solicitor besides, and there before his servants and the assembled house that had branded her a thief. He would produce his dead mother's needlework and the truth it had held, open the hiding place before their eyes, bring out the deed and the letter and the proof, and clear Honoria Aldercott's name in the sight of all who had blackened it, and set the law upon the true criminal at the very moment of his fancied safety. It was a stern plan, and a just one, and it asked of Honoria a little more patience, a little more of the hard waiting she had borne so long, but she had courage, and she trusted the grave man who had become, though neither of them yet spoke of it, so much more to her than her defender, and she held her nerve, and waited for the hour. And Lucius Aldercott, in those days, knew at last the taste of fear, and grew desperate, and began, for the first time in his long smooth career of treachery, to make the small mistakes that desperation makes. He could not understand the Viscount's obstinacy. He had counted on the thing being over in a day or two, the wife cast out and disgraced, and himself safe, the road to Cheverel clearing at last, and this dangerous delay, this keeping of the accused in the house, this cold new attention he felt turned upon himself in his cousin's hard watchful eye, filled him with a creeping dread that his masterpiece was somehow going wrong, though he could not see how. He tried, smoothly and urgently, to press for the wretched business to be finished and the wife put away and the family's honor cleared. He even ventured to hint that his lordship's strange tenderness for a proven adventuress might itself become a scandal. But the Viscount met all his smooth urgings with a cold level look and a short word that Lucius found he could not pass. And worse, he began to feel in that hard eye a cold questioning turned upon his own long-trusted self that he liked not at all. And so, baffled and frightened, he fell back on watching for what his cousin meant to do, and on holding himself ready, if the worst came, to fly with what he could. He had reckoned every visible piece on the board, the poor wife's friendlessness, the ready slander, the missing deed, the forged proofs, the united suspicion, the ruin made sure, and found the reckoning perfect. But he had overlooked two things, because he could not see their worth, the strange cleverness of the very woman he framed, who alone could read what was hidden, and a faded scrap of a dead woman's needlework on a wall he had passed 100 times, that a dying mother's love and wit had made the key to everything. He never thought of the sampler at all. That was his error, and it was enough. The day came, a hard, bright autumn day with the light lying clear and pitiless over the great house and the brown dale beyond, and Gabriel Aldercott had made his quiet preparations, and brought his people together in the great hall of the house, and had the county magistrate present, a solid, upright, sensible gentleman named Sir Gideon Ferrers, whom the Viscount had privately begged to attend on a grave matter touching the honor of the house, and the family's own honest old solicitor, Mr. Ambrose Quill, come up from the town with his papers and his knowledge of the estate's every tangle, and the faithful old Mrs. Hale stood grave and ready at hand. The household was there, the servants ranged and murmuring, all agog at this strange solemn summons and this grave presence of the law. And Lucius Aldercott was there, smooth and grave and outwardly composed, but with a cold, sick fear gnawing beneath his calm, for every instinct of the hunted schemer in him was screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. And Honoria Aldercott was there, pale and still, brought in by her husband's side, holding in her two hands, for the first time before them all, the faded embroidered sampler of the dead Lady Aurelia, outwardly a disgraced wife brought to hear her doom, inwardly a soul strung tight with hope and dread, waiting for the grave cold man to keep his word. And when they were assembled, and the murmuring had stilled, Gabriel Aldercott stood up before them all, in the cold bright hall, and spoke, in his level voice that carried to every corner of it. He said that he had brought them together, and had begged the presence of Sir Gideon Ferrers as a magistrate and of Mr. Quill as the family's solicitor, because a grave and a horrible wrong had been done in that house, and he meant to see it all set right before them all, that the young Viscountess, his wife, lately accused among them of robbing the house and worse, had been, he was now assured past all doubt, falsely and wickedly accused, and that he would show them, then and there, by proof they could not gainsay, both that she was innocent, and by whose hand the true guilt lay, and that the same hand had wronged not her only but the whole house and the ancient inheritance itself. And there fell on that hall a silence like the silence after a thunderclap, and every face turned, and Lucius Aldercott, by the great hearth, went slowly gray, and gripped the back of a chair, and fought to keep his smooth face still. And the Viscount, quite unmoved, turned to the magistrate, and to the solicitor, and to the company, and told them all. He told it plainly and coldly and completely, and he had the proofs in his hand and his mother's needlework beside him. He told them first how he had doubted the two pad evidence and the strange zeal of the accusation, and how it was one man who had raised the fears and shaped the suspicion and pressed the search and known where to look, how he had sought his accused wife out and heard her, and believed her, and how she had turned his eyes to a thing hidden all these years in plain sight upon a wall of his own house, his dead mother's sampler. And then, before them all, he had his wife show and read the thing, and Honoria Aldercott, in a clear steady voice that grew surer as she went, laid the faded needlework before the magistrate and the solicitor, and told them how the broad ornamental border was no border but a cipher, worked in the very stitches by the late Lady Aurelia, and read out to them stitch by stitch the message a dead woman had left, the naming of Lucius Aldercott as the dead ruined enemy of the house, and the exact direction to the hidden deed. And then the Viscount led them, magistrate and solicitor and household and all, to the old chamber and the carved panel, and there, before their very eyes, the spring was pressed and the panel swung and the hiding place laid open, and the wrap packet drawn out of the ancient wall where it had lain 10 years, and Gabriel Aldercott laid its whole contents upon the great table. And there they were, the three thunderbolts, plain before them all. First, the true deed of the fresh settlement, that Mr. Quill the solicitor took up and examined and pronounced, in a voice of great emotion, to be the very deed so long lost. Whole and good and unquestionable, that made the estate the Viscount's own past all doubt and gave the old conveyance that Lucius held the plain flat lie. Second, the dead Lady Aurelia's own letter, read out grave and clear, her testimony out of the grave, that she had hidden the deed against the reaching of the grasping cousin Lucius, whom she named and warned against, and that any slander that smooth man should spread against an innocent soul to clear his road was a lie of his making. The dead mother's own word clearing her son's wronged wife before them all. And third, the proof that damned him, the letter in Lucius Aldercott's own hand, taken up and read and confirmed, that betrayed in his own words his desperate debts and his cold reckoning upon the estate and his very design of coming at it, and proved him past all denying exactly the ruined and grasping schemer his aunt had named. And the Viscount, turning his cold level eyes full upon the grey and shaking man by the hearth, laid it all together before them, plain and pitiless. Here was the man who had raised the alarm and shaped the slander and pressed the search. And here was that same man proved, by his own dead kinswoman and his own hand, a ruined schemer who stood to take the whole estate if his lordship died. Childless, and who had every reason under heaven to see the young wife cast out barren and disgraced before an heir could come and bar him. "Let them look," he said in a voice gone terrible, at the man whose whole ruined hope hung on the casting out of that innocent woman, and ask themselves who had framed her and why. And then, while they were still reeling from it, the Viscount dealt the last stroke, the one that broke Lucius Aldercott past all mending. He said that, having doubted his kinsman in more than this, he had that very morning, quietly and with the magistrate's authority, caused Mr. Lucius's own rooms and his private desk and his locked press to be searched, and that there had been found, and he had it brought in then, and set upon the table before them all, the very tools and materials of the forgery that had been used against the Viscountess, the spoiled trials and studies of her hand that a forger makes before he perfects his imitation, the fellow sheets and the drafts of the very letters that had been planted on her, and, worst of all for him, the whole hidden record of his ruin and his treachery, the sheaf of his own desperate debts and his creditors' threatening letters, the secret memoranda of his dealings, and, the thing that closed it all, laid by in his own most private place, the further evidence of his years-long concealment of the very deed of settlement, that proved him the thief who had stolen it away. And there it lay, the forger's tools and the proof of the debts and the record of the theft, upon the great table in the cold bright light, the guilty craft in the true criminal's own keeping. And a great gasp and then a great murmur went round the hall, and every eye turned, cold now and terrible, upon Lucius Aldercott. And the smooth plausible man, exposed in his own long treachery and caught with the very tools of the forgery and the debts that named his motive and the proof of the theft that had begun it all, his masterpiece shattered and his ruin certain and the law's hand as good as on his shoulder, lost, for the only time in his hard smooth life. His cold command of himself, he blustered, and denied, and then, seeing the proofs on the table and the horror on every face turning now against him, he broke, and cried out, and would have fled, but the Viscount's men were at the doors, and Sir Gideon Ferrers, grave and terrible now in his office, laid the law's hand upon him, and Lucius Aldercott, the smooth schemer who had stolen his kinsman's inheritance and reached to ruin an innocent wife to keep it, was taken, then and there a detected felon to answer for the whole of it before the law. And it all came out in the days that followed, the old theft of the deed and the long concealment, the debts and the desperate design, the forged proofs and the wicked frame. The whole cold history of his treachery unraveled at last, and Lucius Aldercott was carried away to his trial and his ruin, undone utterly, ruined by the two things his cold reckoning had never thought to fear, the cleverness of the woman he had framed, and a dead woman's needlework upon a wall. And Honoria Aldercott stood in the cold bright hall, in her plain gown, with the dead lady's sampler in her hands, cleared before them all, cleared in the sight of the very household that had branded her a fortune hunter and a thief, her innocence proved, her good name restored, the true criminal unmasked and taken, the estate saved and made sure, and the whole cruel frame broken to pieces before the eyes of all who had believed it. The household, that had been so cold and so sure, looked now upon the wronged young mistress with ashamed and wondering respect, and some with tears, for they saw how nearly they had helped to ruin an innocent lady, and how they had all been played by the smooth kinsman they had trusted. And Honoria, who had borne so much with so still a courage, felt the long dreadful strain break in her at last, and stood trembling, hardly able to believe that it was over, and she lifted her eyes, across all that murmuring hall, to the grave face of the man who had married her without love and had come, alone of all the world, to believe her, and to set his whole strength between her and ruin. And she saw in his eyes, meeting hers, a look that no one else there could read, and that told her, without a word, everything. She did not fall into her husband's arms before them all, and he did not ask it, and that is the last and best thing to know of them, for it is the whole meaning of her story. She was cleared now, and safe, and her good name her own again, but there lay between them still the cold beginning of their marriage, the loveless arrangement and the neglect and the half-belief in her guilt, and the Viscount was too proud and too honorable to presume, in the hour of her rescue, upon a love he had done nothing to deserve. He did a thing then, instead, that showed the whole stern quality of him, and won her more surely than any wooing could have done. He saw to her vindication being made complete and public, so that her good name should stand clear not in that house only, but in the county, and the world that had so lately blackened it. He made her, gravely and before all, such amends as he could, owning openly the wrong that had been done her and the coldness with which he had begun. And then he did the hardest and finest thing of all. He came to her, alone, and told her, quietly, that she was his wife-in-law and cleared in honor and mistress now of Cheverel by right, and that he would neither ask nor take one thing from her that was not freely given, that he knew he had married her without love, and used her coldly and half-believed a lie against her, and had no claim on her heart and deserved none, that she should be free wholly and truly to live as his honored wife on whatever terms she herself chose, near to him or apart from him as she would, and that he would press her for nothing, now or ever, but wait, and that if she should ever, of her own free choosing, come to wish for more between them, she had only to let him see it, but that until she chose it freely, she should have from him nothing that could weigh, by so much as a feather, upon a freedom he had so nearly failed to give her. And she took that freedom, and she used it, and she found it good, and she thought, in the quiet weeks that followed, long and honestly, about the grave cold man who had married her without love, and then, when the whole world condemned her, had believed her and broken her ruin, and asked nothing and set her free. She was mistress of Cheverel now, cleared and honored, and might have lived out her life in a proud grave courtesy at her husband's side and asked no more. But she found, thinking of him with her whole freed heart, that she did not want the courtesy, but the man, that she loved him, not out of gratitude, though she was deeply grateful, but freely, and wholly, and of her own certain choosing, for the stern honesty and the lonely strength, and the hidden gentle heart of him, and for the way he had, alone of all the world, believed her, and defended her, and then, humbly and against his own longing, set her free. And she watched him, in those weeks, be gentle and grave and patient and ask for nothing, and when she was quite sure that it was her own free heart and not the shadow of her rescue that spoke, she let him see it. It was not a letter this time, for they were under one roof. It was a quiet evening by the fire, and a word, and a look, and her hand left in his when he took it, and Gabriel Aldercott, who had waited in a hard, humble patience she never fully knew, understood, and was, for the first time in all his hard life, wholly happy. And this time there was no arrangement, and no coldness, and no false accusation, and no distance. There were only two proud, lonely, honest souls who had been bound together without love by the will of others, and had each found, late and against all the cold beginning of it, that the stranger they had wed was the one other creature in the world they could wholly trust and wholly love. meeting now freely and as equals on the far side of the storm. The winter that followed, and the spring that came after, were the making of them. For the cold marriage that had begun in a church with two indifferent hearts was, as it were, begun again by their own free choosing. And this time it was true. He told her, one soft evening in the early spring, gravely and simply, that he had begun to love her on the day she stood alone and wronged before them all and did not break, and had loved her past all telling from the hour she bent over his mother's needlework and read out a dead woman's love, and that he had set her free because he could not bear to take, by her gratitude or her dependence, what he longed for only as her free gift. And he asked her then, not as a rescuer to a rescued nor a husband claiming a right, but as a man to the woman he loved, whether she would be his wife now in truth and in heart, as she had so long been in name. And Honoria Aldercott, who was mistress now of her own restored life and her own good name and needed nothing any man could give her, said yes, freely and gladly, and of her own full choosing, because she loved him, and for no other reason under heaven, and gave herself, not as a wronged creature rescued nor a wife bound by another's arranging, but as a free woman choosing, the one gift that is worth nothing unless it is given free. And they were, from that spring, as happy as ever two people were who had come to love late and hard won and sure. The great house, that had been so cold and had shut its doors against her, opened now, glad and ashamed and loyal, to the wronged lady come into her own, and the household that had once closed against the fortune hunter served now, with ashamed devotion, the mistress they had so nearly helped to ruin. The estate, saved by the deed and settled and made sure, was set in order by the two of them together, and its debts, cleared of the drain of Lucius's long treachery, began slowly to mend, and the ancient house, that the old lord had striven so to keep and the dead lady had loved and guarded even from her grave, was made secure at last for the children that came, in the fullness of time, to fill its cold rooms with warmth, and the great burden of Gabriel's long lonely struggle was eased, not by any fortune, but by the coming into it of a heart that understood his own. She lived long and honored and beloved, the once branded fortune hunter of Cheverel Court, its lady now and its mistress and the wife of a great and mended heart, cleared and free and loved. And she kept, to the end of her long life, two faithful customs that those who loved her understood and strangers did not. She kept always, taken down now from the cold wall and hung in honor in her own warm rooms, the dead Lady Aurelia's embroidered sampler, its stitched secret long since read and its work long since done, but the faded needlework itself dearer to her than any jewel she owned. For the gentle far-seeing woman who had made it, and the mother's love and wit that had reached out of the grave to save the house and the wronged bride her son had wed, and she would take it sometimes in her hands, in quiet moments, and be still, remembering the clever loving lady she had never known and yet felt she knew better than any living soul, who had armed her against a danger she could only guess at and hidden the saving of them all in the one thing a schemer would never think to read. And she taught her own daughters, in their turn, both her mother's needle and her father's learning, the fine true stitch and the reading of an old hidden hand, that the two gifts that had saved her should not die. And she set it down for those who should come after her, the whole plain truth of her story, how the poor and friendless may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and powerful. How a proud hard man's plain love of justice had refused to let a wrong stand when all the world was content that it should. And how there are things a schemer will steal and forge and flourish, and things he will never think to read, because he cannot see their worth nor guess their meaning. And the faded needlework a hard man passes over as a dead woman's pretty sewing may hold, stitched plain before his blind eyes, the one key that names the hiding place where the truth he thought he had stolen and forged away lies waiting, safe, to undo him. And on the one day in all the year that was the anniversary of that cold bright morning in the great hall, when the truth was read out of the silk, and her name given back to her before all the world, the Lady of Cheverel would go alone, in the evening to the quiet of her own room, and take down the fated sampler, and hold it a while, and be still, with the memory of the gentle mother-in-law she had never met, and the wonder of her own hard-won deliverance, and the deep sure love of the grave clear-eyed man who had believed her when all the world would have condemned her, and had loved her enough to set her free before he ever asked her to be truly his. That was the whole of Honoria's story, the loveless match and the false accusation and the smooth schemer who reached to ruin her to steal an estate, and the dead mother's foresight and the cold husband's justice that broke the frame, and the faded needlework upon a wall that held the key when all the visible world was against her. And if you have stayed by her side to the end of it, as I asked you at the first to do, then you have seen the thing I have been waiting to tell you, which is that the truth of an honest soul is worth more than all the evidence a liar can plant against it, and will out at the last if there is but one just heart to seek it, and that a good woman's love and foresight can reach out of the grave to arm and save those who come after her, and that there are things worth more than a schemer can see or read, hidden in what he passes over, waiting only for the day of need. And so the candle burns low on another tale. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.